Hi everybody, how are you doing? Hopefully you are all well. In this video we're going to start looking at software and gaming, which addresses Unit 15p3. Now first of all, before we start this video, just to let you know that I'm going to split this video into two, just to try and make it a little bit more broken down, a little bit more manageable if you want to try and find something in the future. So we're going to have dependencies, operating systems and drivers in this presentation, and then in the other presentation we're going to look at application software, scripting software and sound and graphic APIs, along with the description of the task that you'll need to do. So let's just start off with learning outcomes. So this is pass criteria. You're going to get a lot of describing. So we're looking, like I said, at operating systems, application software, scripting software. So the bottom two are on the other PowerPoint, but the operating system is on this one, along with things like dependencies and drivers. So we'll start off with dependencies, and basically what we're looking at here is there's two different types of dependencies when you're making a game. So the game could be device dependent. So what this means is the game has been made for a specific device. Now this was very common when games first came out, because all of the game consoles were very different from one another. So for example, the Super Nintendo was very different to the Mega Drive, and the games couldn't really be made for both devices without being quite complex, and probably it probably cost a lot of money to them. I don't know exactly how much it would have cost. It was before my time, I'm pleased to say, but yeah. So especially things like the games that would only be playable on a single device, and these days there are one or two of them, but nowhere near as many. So the ones that I can think of are things like Gears of War, things like Wii Sports. They would only be playable on a single device, but there are not many of them these days. And to be honest, it kind of makes sense, because if you're only making it playable on one device, you're massively limiting the amount of people that can actually buy your device. I mean, PS4 and Xbox in particular are so evenly split in terms of the number of people that own each type of device, that really you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot with it. And that's where the device independent comes in, where the games will be developed multi-platform. And I guess it is easier these days, because if you think about the two big games consoles that are out in a minute, Xbox and PS4, they're both CD-based games. Now I assume that there is different technologies behind that, of which I'm not going to lie, I haven't looked too much at myself. But in terms of actually making this stuff, it's probably much easier now than it was in the past. And obviously even games for PC are generally either on a CD or downloaded, so that there shouldn't really be an issue with that. And especially with Microsoft games on the Xbox, you can get things where you buy a game on one device and it is available cross-platform. So for example, I bought Shadow of War a couple of weeks back, and the actual license allows me to play it on my PC and on my Xbox, should I wish. However, my PC unfortunately isn't good enough. But anyway. You also need to talk about operating systems. So there are many more operating systems than what I can cover in this video, and you are free to talk about others if you want to talk about others. That's entirely your call to make. However, I will cover some of the major ones, some of the ones that you are likely to want to cover. So first of all, definition of operating system: something that manages your computer's hardware and software. And obviously the big one is Windows. Or at least for your desktop style PC, the big one is Windows. And the current release of Windows is Windows 10. However, the most popular is Windows 7. That's not a big surprise, because businesses are generally slow to move on to another operating system, because the amount of upheaval for a business is actually quite big to move from one operating system to another. And also you need to think about things like security issues. Is Windows 10 as secure as Windows 7? Probably not. Most of the bugs will have been fixed for Windows 7. Now, the reason why Windows is so popular is things like its ease of use, automation systems within it. So, for example, if you're using things like Word, you can easily do things like spell check. You can easily do things like adding headers, footers, putting images in there, and so on. Mac OS was used with Macintosh computers, Apple. Now, these are rarely used in mainstream industry. However, you may find them in things like graphical style companies, because Macintosh computers are very good if you are doing graphical work. However, they're not as well used within other types of industry, because Windows is cheaper, and it does everything that you need it to do. But also people find it more difficult to use Mac in general, because they're used to using Windows. I mean, that is really the big issue here. So I've got a couple of stats on there that 11.7% of people use Windows. Now that is including all devices, so you have desktop, mobile devices, and anything else that might exist. So the 11.7 is probably going to be a lot of laptop and desktop, and far less phone. Whereas if you have the 12.37, that is with Mac OS, and that includes iOS, you're probably going to have more phone devices in there. There are mobile devices you'll need to talk about. So, for example, Android by Google is by far the most widely used operating system out there in the market, where over half the amount of people use some kind of Android device. So, obviously, if you're sitting there thinking, well, in terms of the phone usage, that's probably split very closely between Android and iOS. However, Android can do much more than that. So, for example, Android is used in TVs, cars. You've got your watches and so on. BlackBerry, I'm not so familiar with. However, obviously, BlackBerry still have their line of smartphones out there. Now, the support for BlackBerry 10, which is the current operating system, will end in 2019. What will happen after that, we'll have to wait and see. BlackBerry phones used to be quite big when I was a lot younger, but they're not so big these days. Mainly for business bigwigs, to be honest with you. And you've got an operating system called Sailfish, which is used from a Finnish company called Jolla, who makes smartphones and tablets. Now, they're quite a new company, and they're expanding across Northern Europe, into places like Estonia and Sweden and so on. So we'll see whether or not they actually go further with that. But you'll find the vast majority of mobile devices will either use Android or iOS. They are the big ones, really. You also need to talk about drivers. So obviously, driver is something that will control the way that a device works. So, for example, you can have drivers for graphics, sound, networking, and interfaces. Now, it's difficult to talk about these individually, because ultimately they're all kind of relevant to specific things that you might install. So, for example, if you have a specific graphics card, it's going to have a specific driver. If you have a specific sound card, again, that's going to have its own drivers coming in with it. And these will help control the device when it's installed onto your machine, and to help it work better. And obviously, it's difficult to pick out individual ones right now, because you simply don't know what everybody's going to have. However, each one of these items, the graphics card, the sound card, networking, any peripherals, interfaces, all of these are going to have their own drivers. So I'll stop there before moving on to the next video. Hopefully I'll see you there soon.